Thank you for joining us for this book talk today with Melanie Kaplan, author of Lab Dog. I'm Megan Senatore, the Executive Director at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. We're delighted to welcome the audience who's joining us today online, as well as everyone who's joining us from campus, where we have a room set up with a complimentary lunch for our students, faculty, and staff who are joining us to watch the book talk. So the format for today's event is that Melanie will first talk about Lab Dog, and then I'll invite two of our William C. Borst Anti-Vivisection Scholarship recipients to co-moderate with me. We will also welcome audience questions. So for those of you who are online, you can share your questions with us by submitting them through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you who are on campus, you can write your question down and provide it to Professor Reddy, who's in the room. And so with that, I am honored to introduce Melanie. Melanie Kaplan is a longtime independent journalist whose travel and science writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, National Geographic, and National Parks Magazine. She's a graduate of Columbia Journalism School, a 2021-2022 MIT Knight Science Journalism Fellow, and a third-generation Washington, D.C. native. Lab Dog is her first book, and I would like to share just on a personal note, for those of you who may not have yet read the book but are joining us today, it is moving, it is eye-opening, and it was described by the late, great Jane Goodall in her review of the book as remarkable, and I agree. So with that, welcome, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's really, really nice to be here. And I just wanted to say, as a young journalist, I applied to law school and I was accepted to law school because I thought I wanted to be a journalist with a law degree, and that would help me understand everything that went on in the world. And I ended up deciding not to go and deciding that 3 years was a long time and a lot of money to be studying the law. So I became a journalist without a law degree, but I did have a chance to be part of Delcy Winder's animal welfare law class at Vermont Law and Graduate School in 2022. I was an animal law fellow there, and I just got such a great taste of it. I wish I could have stayed an entire year. I have such respect for the work that's going on in animal law right now, and it really is an honor to be here. So thank you for inviting me. So, as we start seeing pictures of Hammy, I will just tell you a little bit about him before I get into more of the nuts and bolts of the book. So, Hammy was adopted in 2013, and actually, I have a picture here of the day that he came home with me. He was a foster at the time, and all I knew is that he was from a lab in Virginia. And so for many years, I introduced him to people and I showed them the tattoo in his ear because all of the dogs that are bred for research have tattoos. That's how they're identified. And people were surprised that dogs were used in research. And I really didn't know anything about it. So when the pandemic came around, I lost all of my freelance work. I was doing a lot of travel writing at the time. And I realized that the story that I needed to tell was sitting right next to me on the couch. And that was the story of Hammy. So I think I'm going to go into a little history first, because even though you want to just hear about Hammy, it is important to understand how we got here and a little bit about how we came to be researching and testing and educating using dogs. So the 1600s, way back, is when the first successful blood transfusion happened. And that was between two dogs. And that was particularly interesting to me because I had a blood transfusion almost 20 years ago. And that was probably my first big aha when I started doing the book reporting in 2021, that, oh my gosh, animal research touches all of us: drugs, medical devices, procedures. And so I really went deep into the 1600s and the early days of experimenting on animals back when there was no anesthesia and they were using street dogs or their own pet dogs. And eventually we got to the point where this was a more regulated process. And so jump ahead to after the Civil War. I often get the question of why beagles? Well, beagles were brought to this country after the war and they were used for hunting. They were used for a sport called beagling, which is basically setting your beagles out and having them chase rabbits down. And so we had a lot of kennels of beagles, and the breeders were constantly trying to breed a healthier and a better beagle. Around this time, eugenicists were also talking about how we could use dogs to learn more about human genetics. So it was really an interesting time. And when Cornell opened the research lab for diseases of dogs in 1951, those dogs were meant to be used for dog diseases, but eventually they used them to start funding the center by selling them to test for human products and eventually human diseases. One of the big original uses of beagles was for radiation experiments, which started in the country in 1950. And so this Cornell Center sold some of their beagles to the University of Rochester, which was one of 6 centers around the country testing radioactive substances on beagles. And so before long, we had this big system of breeding beagles and experimenting on beagles. And when it became required that pharmaceutical companies had to test on animals, beagles were being bred and sold and available for those purposes. So if you do want to read more on this, there's a couple great papers. Brad Boldman wrote a paper called Dogs for Life, Beagles, Drugs, and the Capital in the 20th Century. And Jeremy Beckham wrote a paper called Radioactive Beagles. And it's also important to remember that around this time, pet dogs were being stolen from backyards. So think like 50s, 60s. There's one Dalmatian in particular named Pepper who became famous because she was stolen from her yard in 1965. And Sports Illustrated ended up writing an article about this. Um, she was stolen from her yard in Pennsylvania, and 9 days later, she was found on the operating table of a hospital in the Bronx because they were testing a new way to implement a pacemaker. So this made national news. And the next year, in 1966, Life magazine came out with a big cover story about dogs being stolen and dogs being kept in terrible conditions and sold to labs. And ultimately, all of these, the media coverage and lawmakers finding out about this and the public outcry led to the Animal Welfare Act, which was passed in 1966. So that did not immediately stop the theft of dogs, and it definitely didn't stop research. Nothing in it says we cannot research on dogs or other animals, but it did regulate the process a little bit. So now labs had to have certain sizes of their cages for the animals. And there were certain things they had to do when they transported the animals, and they had to report the number of animals they used every year. So after that was passed in 1966, it's interesting because the Life magazine article says that we might have used as many as 2 million dogs a year, which is shocking. That's the highest number that I ever saw in my research. And then 2 years after the Animal Welfare Act passed, the number was 435,000, which is still shocking. And has been a slow decline since then. But before we get to that, it's important to understand that the three big industrial beagle breeders were all founded around the time that the theft of dogs became illegal. So you don't have the stealing of dogs, but you now have a big industrialized system which coincidentally happened around the time that the government was requiring drugs to be tested on animals. So these three big beagle breeders that all came into existence in the 1960s were in Cumberland, Virginia, and upstate New York, and Wisconsin. So they were all located in rural spots. They're kind of hidden. You would never know that they're there. And really by, the late 1960s, there was this system in place. I'm just going to read a very short passage from the book that kind of sums up dog research and progress. Researchers say dogs are good proxies or models for humans in the study of human disease. According to Understanding Animal Research, a UK-based nonprofit funded largely by pharmaceutical companies, academic institutions, and disease-focused charities, we share more than 350 diseases with our canine friends. From time to time, there's a dramatic breakthrough with dogs and labs, as when two Canadian researchers used them to discover insulin more than a century ago. In that case, a severely diabetic dog named Marjorie gained renown after researchers kept her alive in the lab for 70 days, much longer than untreated dogs typically survived. But typically, scientific progress is slow and complicated. Medical advances can rarely be credited to two humans, and the dogs who lose their lives along the way go unnamed. Marjorie was an exception. And Hammy also is an exception because very few dogs, or other species for that matter, get out of the labs. I didn't really understand how animal testing and animal research worked, but once I dove into the testing aspect, particularly with pesticides and drugs, I learned that most of the dogs are given, and other animals are given, very high doses of whatever the substance is. Maybe it's a weed killer or it's a diabetes drug. So huge doses, much larger than humans would take, and then they're killed to study their organs and their tissues, and they weigh different body parts and compare them to the control animals. So the dogs that do get out are rare, and as of today, there's no record keeping on how many of those dogs get out. But Hammy was released in 2013 with a group of 6 other beagles. They were all named after the founding father, so he's actually Alexander Hamilton. And like I said, I showed people his tattoo, and I really tried to make him comfortable at home because he was really scared. He had never seen stairs before. He didn't really know what to do with all the sounds of the city. And it was a very slow progression. And over the years, he did become much more confident. So by the time I decided to write this book or start working on this book, we would travel around, and he was okay being in new places rather than trembling for, a long time. He would adjust pretty quickly. And I think I credit a lot of that to the bond that we developed and him just seeming to trust me, that I could push him outside of his comfort zone, but that I was still going to be there to protect him. So when I set out on this project, I had this crazy goal that I wanted to meet the people who experimented on Hammy. And I wanted to meet the people who were responsible for breeding him. And so one of the first things I did is try to figure out where Hammy was born. And it turns out he came from the breeder in Cumberland, Virginia, that eventually was bought by a company called Invigo. So I was blown away by the scale of these breeders. I, for some reason, was picturing kind of these backyard small breeders, and I wasn't even picturing a legal operation, but of course it's legal. And these breeders produce thousands of beagles every year and sell them. I mean, they're commodities and sell them to universities and pharmaceutical companies and private testing companies. And if you know the company in Vigo, it's because this one was in the news more than other beagle breeders. It ended up closing in 2022 because there were so many animal welfare violations, and the company decided to shut down rather than make the changes that were required. The reason that we know so much about Envigo now, and we know everything, we know how that dogs were housed, we know that often dogs got in fights and maybe their ear was nicked or a foot was bleeding, and they would euthanize dogs rather than give them medical care. We know there were bugs in the food. We know all these details because of the work that animal activists did, whether it's taking drone videos or doing undercover investigations, and the Department of Justice going in and seizing beagles in distress. And this eventually ended in more than 4,000 beagles being transferred out of the facility to homes all over the country. During that spring, though, when we didn't know shutting down, we just knew that there were all these animal welfare violations. We knew there was bad stuff happening inside the facility. I remember reading a piece by the Envigo Senior Vice President of Veterinary Services. He wrote in the Virginia Mercury saying, "Animal welfare is a top priority." He said that employees strive to care for the dogs at Cumberland as they do their pets at home. And I still laughable because thinking about the conditions and the lies that were being fed, and it just makes me as a consumer, as a citizen, as a human, wonder what other lies were being fed because animal welfare was not their top priority. So when these dogs were transferred out across the country, it was just this incredibly exciting moment for people who love animals and for me working on this book. And I had Beagle alerts set up on my email. And every single day, there were headlines across the country about beagles arriving in Atlanta and Milwaukee and Portland, Maine and Portland, Oregon. And I got to see a flight of beagles leave from Maryland and fly out to the West Coast. And now I'm getting to meet a lot of these beagles when I go around on book tour. So that is really exciting. Um, I guess, one of the coolest things about this book is that Hammy was with me for most of my reporting. And I took some of the lessons that I learned while I was doing travel writing with him, and I kind of just plugged those in. And instead of going to see travel destinations, I went to meet researchers and ethicists and veterinarians who work in labs and animal activists and people who are grappling with the issue of animal research every day. Hammy and I were invited to visit with two different dog researchers, one who spent most of his career working with dogs on muscular dystrophy. And in Cleveland, we met Francis Chang at PETA, who works with food and beverage companies and tries to get them to stop using animals. Often they use animals to try to prove health claims. I knew once I got into my reporting that we were using dogs for drugs and pesticides, but there kept being surprises over and over again. And this was a big one. I learned from Francis that Welch's, like the grape juice company, funded a study described in a 1998 paper that involved cutting open dogs' chests and administering grape juice, orange juice, and grapefruit juice through a stomach tube to see whether any of the juices impact the formation of blood clots. So there were so many surprises. I mean, the subtitle of my book is The Surprising World of Animal Research. And Sometimes people say, what is the most surprising? And I was surprised by just about everything. Um, I was surprised by even the animals that do get out, that are adopted out, or the farm animals that go on to live at a sanctuary. I was surprised by the tenderness that was shown to them, hoping that they can have a good rest of their life in a peaceful place. Hammy and I spent a couple of weeks at Kindness Ranch, which is a sanctuary in Wyoming that is home to former research animals. And I met llamas and pigs and cows and horses that all have been used in research, and beagles. Um, and I, after Wyoming, we went to Houston, and I went to a science teachers conference where I saw all kinds of animal specimens, because animal specimens are still used in schools. We still use millions of frogs for dissection every year. And so that's when I really started to understand, oh, this is how we all learn about the disposability of animals, that they are not independent beings, individual beings with personalities and likes and dislikes, that we can just sell them and kill them and cut them open and learn from them. But on the flip side, I learned about all the cool technologies that are being used today to teach anatomy and to teach biology that don't involve animals. There are very lifelike looking models of frogs and dogs by a company called Sindaver in Florida. And even in vet schools, the vet schools for a long time used animals for procedures and then killed them, including dogs. That's called a terminal surgery. And so even the vet schools have started relying more on shelter dogs or pet dogs to practice procedures, or they have something called a willed body program. So if your pet dog dies, you can donate your body to be used, their body to be used in the vet school. So there's a lot of ways that education is changing to really rely less and less on live or dead animals. Um, Hammy and I went to Boston, and I went to see a mouse lab and a naked mole rat lab. Naked mole rats, incidentally, are very interesting to researchers because they don't get cancer, they rarely get infections, and they regenerate skin without scarring. So they're hoping to learn something from that species. But I really wanted to see what it looked like, what an animal lab looked like. I had done a lot of reading by that point, and it was helpful for me to walk into a room filled with thousands and thousands of mice in little shoebox size containers, and to understand what their life was like, that they weren't foraging, they weren't sniffing out new smells, they weren't choosing who they could mate with. So that that was really eye-opening to me. And then also in Boston, Hammy and I got to go to the Emulate lab. So Emulate is a company that makes organ chips, and I always have to bring out my show and tell. I don't know. Can you see? Yeah. So this is an organ chip. It's a little silicone device, and it mimics a human organ. So human organ cells are put in one of these channels, and then drugs can be put in the other channel, or bacteria. And that enables a scientist to see how human organs react. And the key here is these are human organs, they're not mouse organs or beagle organs. And so the chip is being used right now by the FDA, by all the top pharmaceutical companies. They're also still using animals, but they are using this chip, and it's really exciting. People are very optimistic about about using it. It's been proven to be more predictive than animals on some studies, and the issue is that we don't have an entire human on a chip yet. So we don't necessarily know how the whole body responds, but this is one of many non-animal technologies that are being developed more and invested in, including organoids and computer modeling and AI. And the government is talking a lot about putting more money into those methods and moving away from animal research. So this is a hard topic. It was a really hard topic to read about and to write about. And, it made me think about things that I do in my own life and not wanting to contribute to animal research more than I had to. I remember there's one story I tell in the book about being stung by a wasp, and I had a really bad reaction. My arm completely swelled up, and I had to go to urgent care. And they gave me some drugs, and I went back to my friend's house where I was stung. And my friend had sprayed this awful toxic spray and killed the wasps. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, now the wasps are dead. And I have this medication, which was tested on dogs, probably. And the spray was tested on dogs and some other animal. And now there's the residue from the spray all over the place. And I was walking on it, and Hammy was walking on it. And at that point, I felt just completely paralyzed. And I realized you can't go through life feeling that way because you have to engage in the world and be out there. And we all use drugs from time to time and products. And um, so I realized I don't want to go through life being paralyzed, but I also really do try to think about, as a consumer, what I'm buying and what I'm supporting. And the more that I learned about it, the more I understood what I could do or what I didn't want to be doing. Um, there's also, I spent a lot of time grappling with the ethics of this, of course, and I went into this really hoping by the end of my research, I would have a very clear answer about how I felt. And didn't. And frankly, I don't feel like it's a black and white issue. Um, the more I learned, the more I realized this is very gray and messy. And I learned about something called the troubled middle. It's a phrase coined by Strachan Donnelly in 1989. And he talks about these two extremes in animal research and those in the troubled middle who recognize that the legitimate and often conflicting needs and requirements of both humans and animal welfare. He says, in short, they wish to balance the undeniable benefits that result from scientific research with a genuine concern for the well-being of animals. And he said it's this group that's most truly vexed by the ethical questions. So it's something that I've been enjoying talking to people about since the book came out, and it is just it's complicated. It's I think that somebody said to me, just because we've all benefited from animal research doesn't mean that we need to keep investing in it and keep the system going. And I completely agree with that. I think that as a country and as a society, we can be doing a lot better than we're doing today. I just want to end on one other area from the book. I wrote a little bit about restorative justice. And when I set out to find the people who experimented on him, I just had my mind set on, I will find this person and he or she will apologize to Hammy. And the idea behind restorative justice, this is a rehabilitative rather than punitive response to wrongdoing. And when I was in Vermont taking Dulcie Winder's class, I talked to some of her colleagues who worked in restorative justice. And I said, look, I cannot find the person who experimented on Hammy or the person who made the decision to breed Hammy. And nobody was returning my emails. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. They said the records weren't there anymore. I can't find these people. And I learned about the idea of a surrogate. So that's somebody who is a stand-in for somebody who's not available. And in the case of restorative justice, that could have been anyone who researched on dogs, for example. And then I found Brittany Hill, a criminal defense attorney who had written about using restorative justice in cases involving animal victims. And, she said that this is not typically used with animals, but, animals wouldn't gain like what we might, for example, from restorative justice, but that the practice would recognize that animals are victims and that their experience, including the pain and suffering, must be acknowledged and repaired. And she said that the process could also be helpful for those who cause the harm. She said that they might learn a lot about sentience and how their actions have negatively impacted animals. And I'll just always remember what she said. She said, even though nobody committed a crime experimenting on Hammy, there still was harm. She said, victims are beings. Someone imposed something on them that they didn't ask for, that wasn't their own good, for their own good. She said, Hammy didn't understand it or want it. I doubt any dog would want that. So I will turn it back over to you, Megan, and I will look forward to answering some questions.
All right. Thank you, Melanie, so much. And we really appreciate you sharing insight from the book and also shining a light on this issue because so many people don't know about the history of the use of companion dogs in research or that we still do it. So I also appreciated your slideshow with Hammy because I told you offline that I had heard that the book was one part like investigative journalism and the other part love story. I was not prepared for the depth of your love story with Hammy, and I felt like I met a friend reading the book, so I really appreciated seeing all of the pictures of Hammy. I also wanted to give a shout out to someone who's in our audience today, which is Jeremy Beckham, who is the author of Radioactive Beagles. He is a third-year law student with us at Lewis and Clark Law School, and I understand he's in the audience today. And then also Brittany Hill, who you spoke with about restorative justice, is an alum of the Lewis and Clark JD Animal Law program. So it's great connections to make. So with that, I want to invite our two co-moderators up to join me. And so let's make sure that we have them on camera as well. And so I'd like to introduce our two recipients of the William C. Borst Anti-Vivisection Scholarship who are going to co-moderate with me today. And we're very grateful to the William C. Borst Trust that provides this full tuition scholarship opportunity for an outstanding incoming animal law LLM or animal law MSL student who's interested in anti-vivisection work. Priority is given to applicants who are passionate about ending the use of companion dogs in research, as that was the area of passion for Mr. Borst. And both Denise and Jen have received this award. So first I want to welcome Denise, who is currently pursuing her animal law LLM in our program. She's the operations and legal counsel at Sentient Media, and she previously has experience as an attorney with the Department of Justice. So welcome, Denise. And then Jennifer is a 2023 alum of our Animal Law MSL program, and she currently is a research and campaigns coordinator for the Laboratory Investigations Department at PETA. Her work focuses largely on trying to shut down the primate importation pipeline, a billion-dollar industry in which wild-caught macaques are captured and smuggled into the US for use in laboratory research. So they're going to join us to moderate. As I mentioned previously, your questions are welcome in the Q&A feature, and we'll try to get to some of those as well. So Denise, why don't you get us started with our first question?
Hi, thank you so much first for allowing me to participate in this webinar. The topic is something I'm very passionate about as a lifelong dog lover and also as a former veterinary technician who did attend a university that did house beagles for educational purposes. For the first question, it's kind of related to the book and your background as a journalist. So in your work, you discuss how language in animal research can obscure what's actually happening to animals. In my role as in-house counselor at Sentient Media, working alongside journalists, I'm often thinking about how we stay both precise and legally accurate. How do you think journalists should approach that without defaulting to the same framing used by institutions?
I love this question. I thought about this a lot. I think one of the easiest things to do is use gender specific pronouns.
Hmm.
So sometimes even when we're talking about humans, we'll say the people that were in the clinical studies, but really it's the people who were in the clinical studies. And it should be the dogs who were in the studies, or the mice who were in the studies, or the ticks who were used in the study. Um, I think that's a real easy one. And journalists need to do better asking questions about the animals rather than just hearing, oh, we did this rat study and here's what we learned. Well, who were the rats? How many rats? Did any of them get adopted out? How old were they? Um, because these are the big important players in these studies. So the least we can do is learn about who they are or who they were. And, you know, I don't know how much control journalists have over this, but certainly scientific papers can also do better addressing the animals and talking about who's involved and where the animals came from, where they ended up, because the more we learn about these animals, the more people will care about them.
Thank you, Melanie. And I'm going to actually fold in an audience question, which is a good segue from what Denise just asked. What did your investigation lead you to conclude about how many animals are used in US labs today?
Hmm. Well, what I failed to mention when I was speaking before, the Animal Welfare Act from 1966 has never included mice or rats or fish or invertebrates. And so we don't even have a clear number. Larry Carboni wrote a paper that estimated we could have more than 100 million mice and rats used in labs every year. So I think that when you start including all of the animals, the numbers are well over 100 million a year. When you're just talking about those covered under the Animal Welfare Act, which is dogs, cats, rabbits, pigs, primates. I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody, but that is 700 some thousand a year.
Thank you. And I'm going to welcome Jen to answer or to ask rather the next question.
Hello, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I apologize in advance. I have my 5-month-old with me and she keeps screaming. So hopefully that doesn't happen. But my question focuses on how you wove Hammy's story into your investigative reporting. And I think you did a really great job of allowing readers to really have an emotional connection with him, whereas usually people can kind of compartmentalize lab animals versus the animals in their own lives. So I was wondering how you think animal advocates could do a better job of kind of using that storytelling perspective to help people relate to other animals that they might not have firsthand experience with, like monkeys or rats or rabbits.
Yeah, that's tough because some of these animals don't get adopted out, and so we don't know their stories. But anyone who has ever gotten to know a chicken or a ferret or a rat knows that they all have personalities. So I think for those that do get adopted out, whether it's a pig in a sanctuary or a dog who's living in a home, I feel like there is a responsibility to let the world know who they are and the system that they came from. Um, and I think in terms of the animal advocates work, I think that we can just do better educating people about animals in general. So we have, millions and millions of zebrafish that are being used in research right now. And, there's a whole book, Jonathan Balcom wrote a book about fish. And, we could surprise people telling them what fish feel um, and what they experience. And same, I mean, he wrote another book called Superfly about flies. So I think getting to know what these animals are as a species and who they are as individuals, if we know them, is is a step that we can take in terms of like who is in the labs and why are we studying them, what are their, the animals amaze us every day, right? And I just think understanding more about that might help bridge that gap between the the individuals in the labs and what the public knows.
Didn't unmute for me there. Thank you, Melanie. One of our guests in the audience wanted to mention that the guest is from Canada and they have no legislation in a country with a population the size of California that over 10,000 dogs are used each year there. However, that's just what's reported. Private labs are not bound by law to report. And she wanted to thank you, Melanie, for sharing your love and your experience and sharing Hammy's world with all of us. So I wanted to give that one from the audience.
Thank you.
You bet. So, Melanie, one of the things I appreciate about Lab Dog is how you successfully bypass the typical good versus evil binary that we see used so often in this discussion, where both sides tend to characterize the other one as the villains. And you opted instead for a really compassionate, nuanced approach. So I was curious whether that was something that you went into the project with the goal of deconstructing those typical narratives, or whether it was the people you met during your investigation that caused you to wrestle with those complexities in real time. How did you get to that outcome?
I went into this thinking that I would find kind, good intentioned people on both sides. I really didn't think I was going to find monsters in the lab or crazy cat ladies protesting outside the lab. But certainly meeting all these different people myself, it definitely caused me to wrestle with this more. Hammy and I went into the homes of two of these dog researchers who trusted me and trusted him to spend hours in their home. And they didn't sound delusional to me when they talked about curing a disease and about their children, about what they were trying to do with their work. They have a different mindset about animals than the activists I talked to. They feel like human lives and finding cures for humans is more important than the animal lives. But I can see both of those sides. I could understand both of those and hold both of those truths within me. And, as a journalist, like I need to be able to tell that story because both of those things exist.
There we go. We have a question from our classroom at Lewis and Clark that asks, Melanie, you mentioned that restorative justice wouldn't serve animals in the same way that it would serve the humans who work to save them from a laboratory setting. But I think that restorative justice could work to support a deterrence theory in a similar way that punitive justice does, by targeting those who've worked on animals, which would essentially force them to confront their actions. The problem that the questioner sees is finding those researchers or finding a surrogate. Did you have trouble tracking down a surrogate who was willing to face their actions?
Well, I would love to talk to this questioner more about this because I'm still interested in diving more into the restorative justice piece. I I didn't specifically talk to the researchers about restorative justice. This was something that I was trying to figure out in my own mind and spending time with them and feeling out who they were. I, my immediate thought was, oh, like I chickened out. I didn't talk to them about this. But what I did was I brought Hammy into their lives. And so I don't know if they'd ever met a dog who'd been in a lab who was outside of a lab. They had dogs in their lab. They killed dogs in their lab. But somebody said to me later, maybe having them meet Hammy, maybe they did think about it differently later. Maybe, they certainly didn't change their careers. I mean, both of them were either retired or at the end of their career. But, this change takes time, and people, we're so complicated in the way we make changes in our own lives. And so I have to believe that them meeting Hammy did mean something. And yeah, hopefully they're reading the book too, and hopefully learning something from that.
Absolutely. I'm going to invite Denise to ask another question.
So, in writing this book, what was the most surprising or unexpected thing you learned about the world of animal research?
So much was surprising. I I think that to learn about some of these experiments without cringing. I mean, just as a human feeling person, some of them are just really hard to read about. But what surprised me is, some of these dogs had they had champions in the labs whereas maybe, the fish or the rats might not have. Some of the dogs were named, some of the dogs had toys, some of them even got out of their kennels and had volunteers come to play with them. This didn't happen in all the dog labs. One of the researchers I talked to said he doesn't let his staff name the dogs because they get too attached and they only have them for 3 months before they kill them. So it definitely doesn't happen in all labs. But even in the best case scenarios, where the dogs have names and toys and they come out of their cages, they are still confined in a place without new smells and new experiences. And every time I took Hammy to a new place, we went on a road trip, we got to a new hotel, he jumped on the bed or he ran on the beach. He loved these new experiences. He loved exploring and sniffing and taking everything in. And so imagining him not having that for years times 100 million individuals is pretty upsetting and surprising.
Melanie, I'm going to combine two questions from our audience. One of the people who's asking this question has adopted 2 research beagles from Kindness Ranch and wanted to share that they found your book both powerful and painful, and that they admire your ability to look at both sides of the issue and report it, try to report it in an unbiased way. So the question between this person and another is, do you feel that we as a society are making progress with ending research on animals? Is there an end in sight? And can you discuss recent initiatives to reduce or eliminate animal testing?
I think that there are a lot of people really optimistic right now. So just in the last year, the administration has talked about moving away from animal research. The FDA, the EPA, the NIH have all talked about animal research not being the most effective or ethical, and let's put more funding into these non-animal methods. So I think that is all really encouraging. We don't have any new laws yet, but as the funding shifts and as NIH, they have stopped asking for animal specific studies. Like they don't say we want a dog study on diabetes. They will say we have this question about diabetes, and then the researcher can submit a proposal either using a dog or using alternatives or using a combination. So there's still a lot of change that I think can happen. And, whether or not there's an end in sight, I just don't know. I think that we as a society need to decide who we want to be, because we have that choice as voters and as individuals. I mean, right now we are a society that wants to keep moving quickly with advancements in medicine, and we want the best and the newest and all the new things. And maybe we're a society that says we don't do this to animals anymore. And as a result, we might not have a cure for this disease. We could be that society. We have that choice.
Thank you. Jen, are you in a position, if you're in a position to come back and ask a question, we'll go ahead. Otherwise, I will go to the next one.
Yes.
Wonderful. Please go ahead.
So my next question kind of surrounded transparency in the lab space, and I know animal advocates work pretty hard to get some transparency from labs, but you had mentioned that researchers were really reluctant to speak to you for the book. And I guess I'm just curious if you got any inkling from that perspective of if they're so passionate about their work and the results that come out of it, why they aren't more willing to share that with the public, or especially with a journalist working on the issue.
I think some researchers might have wanted to share their work and talk about their work, and they were stopped by their institutions. I think that the institutions in general, they don't see a lot of good that could come out of talking about their dog research or research. Generally, people who live around the university don't like it, donors don't like it, alumni don't like it. And the fear of harassment is a real thing. You know, it's it's a real thing, and I think it's also an easy way for the research community to say no. I think it's both of those things. The industry talked a lot about transparency. I did not experience that. And so the people who did talk to me were a self-selected group who did feel strongly about the importance of sharing this and felt like their colleagues who weren't talking about it were really doing a disservice.
Thank you, Melanie. And we have an audience member who has a question that's a natural follow-up to Jen's question about transparency, which is that often the conditions for release of an animal to a sanctuary or for adoption involve the testing facility's ability to keep secret the nature of the testing on that animal. Have you found that to be an impediment to individual storytelling and public understanding of the plight of research animals?
It could have been an impediment to me telling this story, but instead, you know, I went in and found the types of dog research that might have happened with Hammy, or, you know, the common ways that dogs are used in labs. So just because we don't have that answer doesn't mean we can't still tell a story.
Thank you. So here at Lewis and Clark, as you know, Melanie, we hosted a reading group where students read excerpts from the book, and that reading group was facilitated by our Center for Animal Law Studies teaching fellow, Katie Bester. Thank you, Katie. So arising out of that was a question about adoption. So you devoted a chapter in Lab Dog to providing a historical overview of the adoption of research dogs and the continued importance of adoption in facilitating what you call a kinder place for animals. What our students wanted to know is how can we ensure that people who adopt former research animals are educated on their specific needs and the challenges of adopting those animals given the experiences that they've had in research laboratories?
Well, I have a lot to say about this, just having spent a decade with Hammy, but I also did, I've talked to Chelsea Marino, who's the founder of the Keeper and Kin project, and they actually specialize in training specifically for former research dogs. And, you know, she said that even though their backgrounds, they might have had trauma just as another rescue might have, these dogs from research have you know, they just don't have the same reference points for everyday sounds and environments and people. And, you know, that makes a real big difference in their transition and adjustment. Hammy, for example, he had no spatial awareness. So I'd put him on a bed and he'd roll around and didn't realize that he could have fallen off. You know, I think that what Chelsea said is that some of these dogs are more prone to phobias, or they can be slow to adapt and harder to reach with like traditional training methods. So sometimes, yeah, they actually do, her group does some training, some virtual training, which has been very successful. But I think what I found is just it's so important to pay attention to the individual dog and what they need, and learn how much they can be pushed outside their comfort zone, and really bond with them and make sure that they feel comfortable and trusting.
You certainly got to that point with Hammy based on all the beautiful photos we saw of you sharing time with him. So it's wonderful. One member of our audience recently learned about documentaries that shine a light on issues like Blackfish or Dominion, that have moved people to change, become aware of issues. And they wanted to know if you've given thought to turning Lab Dog into some kind of bigger project after you're done with your book tour to help further raise awareness.
Well, I'm still waiting for Hollywood to call.
Absolutely.
Actually, there is going to be a documentary coming out this summer on PBS that's all about the non-animal methods of testing that I was interviewed for. So I should have more information on that in the coming months. But I will definitely let you know when we have a Hammy star in a documentary.
Yeah. Wonderful. One final question as our time together here is as ending, Melanie. What do you feel like the impact and legacy of the book is, or that you hope it to be? And do you feel that you're reaching new audiences and people that aren't aware already? Most in this community are aware that this is happening, but are you reaching new audiences, and do you feel the book is making an impact to those people?
Gosh, I guess my dream for the book is that it really becomes part of the dialogue around this issue. Just the other day, I got a call out of the blue from a member of Congress who I had sent my book to, and he thanked me for sending it and said he would let me know after he read it. And that was really exciting, because this is where a lot of the change is going to happen. And so if this book can be part of that conversation, or part of the conversation between an animal activist and a researcher, bringing people to the table and discussing how can we really move forward in a better way, that would make me very happy.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Melanie. We do have a further slide, I think, that we'll put up that has the QR code to your main page. I'm going to also put it into the chat so that people can learn about more. They can purchase the book, that they can find out where you're speaking, learn more about you. And we thank you so much for this beautiful book and for raising awareness of this issue and for joining us today. Thank you to Denise and Jen and the William C. Borst Trust for their scholarships that help to fuel more advocates in this space, because we need them. And thank you to all of you for joining us. We appreciate you being here. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.